Good morning, folks. Today we are going to talk about President George W. Bush. So, our relationship is changing because we are now in what I think of as the modern moment. And I think of this, and I think most people probably do too. The 9/11 terrorist attacks really are the thing that propels the United States into our modern understanding of the world. Things changed. Our relationship with the Middle East changed. Our relationship with the Middle East was not the only thing, though. Our relationship with the presidency changed. Our understanding of national security changed. Our understanding of the economy changed. Our understanding of presidents' responsibilities changed. So when I start talking about Bush, we only have this and one more lecture left. Our last class is much more, the one that we're having in person via Zoom. Is much more of a recap and a what do I do with this information kind of a class. But we have this one and one more. And that's because I think it's important in a history class to take you up through today. And I won't get through today, but I at least want to talk about the election of Trump because I think that that's important. So today, and if we were in class, this would be much more back and forth, especially because this is going to increasingly become a world that you are familiar with. So I spent a whole day today on George W. Bush, and then your lecture on Friday will cover Obama and the election of Trump. Let's see, the election of Trump was 2016. Many of you were young, so many of you were 14 when that happened. My first election was the second election of Barack Obama. So we start to get into that in our next lecture. Anyway, the point is, after 2000, particularly after 2001, the things that people thought of as American changed. And we're now talking about pretty thoroughly the modern moment. And so I want to talk to you about Bush. I want to spend a whole day on Bush. I also want to spend a whole day on Bush because he is incredibly controversial. I'm talking other countries have accused him and convicted him of war crimes. So crazy controversial Republican president. Many of you are probably deeply affiliated with him just because he's a Texan, but he's got a really complicated legacy. So all of that is worth exploring. I want to sort of remind you where we're at. Well, no, we'll do that in a second. Okay, sorry. I feel like you have to watch these videos and slowly watch me go insane over the period of quarantine. Sorry about that. Cheers. And never remember that the first slide doesn't change. Okay. What do you need to learn? There are a couple of important things to learn from the Bush era, things that I want you to keep in mind. This story we're going to get back to, that's what the hell is happening in the Middle East, becomes very important in the Bush administration. So we're going to return to a conversation about the Middle East. In returning to that conversation, I hope to explain why 9/11 happened, but also why we are at war in various places in the Middle East. So that's something that we should sort of start following under Bush, and we will continue following that under Obama and also under Trump. In order to understand that, you have to understand the September 11th terrorist attacks. We're going to talk about them. It's interesting for me as a teacher because when I first started teaching, actually that's not true, I'm dating myself. Okay, so this happened when I was 10, but it happened within my memory, right? Most people don't remember the September 11th terrorist attacks that I teach now because y'all are about 10 years younger than me. So when it comes to this, it's just been interesting as a teacher every year to watch it change. As far as you're concerned, though, this is history because you weren't cognizant at the time, for the most part, except for the non-traditional students that I'm teaching, in which case, hi, I see you. So for the most part, this is history, but it's very important, very recent history in the United States. And if you don't, I assume that you know this with the feeling around you, but the United States very much so carries that fear with them today. How did Bush carry on or ignore the legacy of Reagan-era Republicanism? In other words, think about the ways that the Republican Party changes under Bush, what is like Reagan, what is not like Reagan, and I want you to think about this with both Bush and Trump, because those are the Republican presidents post Reagan that have altered what the Republican Party is. So think about and Reagan is still considered, right, that king, and you know about Reagan now. So consider how Reagan's policies have been adapted by other presidents. And I'm going to ask you that same question again when we get to Trump. And then what was the cultural and political impact of Hurricane Katrina? So this massive event that happened, y'all are familiar with hurricanes, right? Like, you know what they do. You know how people are forced to react to them. How did that change the entire story of the United States at that moment? That's where we're going. So let's talk first about the election of 2000. So last we talked about, we were ending Clinton's presidency. Clinton, if you remember, because who does not remember, was accused of having a sexual relationship with an intern, and it was found out that he did have that sexual relationship. You can't be impeached for having a sexual relationship as a president, but he was impeached for having lied to the American public. Now, I would love to tell you that people were like, wow, he made a morally problematic decision, but these were his policies, and we're going to elect our next president based on those policies, not the problematic decision. But that's not actually true, because we have this fascination with sex in this country. So lots of presidents have lied. This is not a new thing. Presidents lie. Back to George Washington. Like, a lot of presidents have been very inconsistent. And in particular, Republican presidents throughout the 20th century had been super inconsistent. Nixon and Reagan, right? But Nixon and Reagan had been inconsistent in ways that did not capture the sensationalist nature of the American news, right? The scandalousness of what Clinton did made people really fearful of the Democratic Party in general, which is remarkable because people actually didn't mind Clinton, Lincoln. It's good, guys. It's good. I mean, I think it's still before 5 a.m., but it's totally good. I can totally talk before 5 a.m. People didn't actually mind Clinton's policies. If you remember, what we talked about is that Clinton really put the left further in the middle, and he acquiesced to many of the right's demands, right? So Clinton was pretty in the middle as far as policy goes, and he was pretty widely popular for his policy, just that he slept with an intern and then lied about it, and that is not necessarily as popular. So Al Gore ran on the legacy of Clinton, and what he said was, I am going to do what Clinton did except for that sex thing. And also we're going to focus on the environment again. George Bush was like, well, clearly Democrats are immoral, and you shouldn't vote for a Democrat because they're immoral, and we're going to go on the legacy of the Clinton administration there. So Clinton really cast a shadow on the election of 2000, which wasn't particularly fair because it was a human indiscretion. Not so much a policy indiscretion, and people actually kind of liked their policies. But because the sex scandal of Clinton so clearly shadowed this election, it became a very controversial election. So I want to play a couple campaign ads for you. Okay. This is no, let's start with Bush. No, we'll end with Bush. Okay, here's a couple of Gore's campaign ads.
Strengthening education begins with us, not with government. Parents simply have to get involved and take responsibility to make sure that their children study and learn. But government has to take responsibility for what it can do. Fix failing schools, reduce the class size, set high standards for students and for teachers. We're in an information age. We have a responsibility to make sure that our schools are the very best in the entire world.
Do you know what information age means? Information age meant this crazy idea that if you didn't know something, you could look it up on a computer, and people were baffled by that. Anyway, Al Gore's campaign, one of the things it focused on was education, and it said, look, education is changing. We live in a technologically changing world, and we need to cope with that. And these are the ways that government can cope with that. Remember that under Republican presidents, there's very much so a focus on non-intervention, right? And Gore does say that. Like, there are some things that are not the government's responsibility, that parents just need to do. But the government can do some things, and these are the ways that the government can be involved and should be involved in education. So that democratic idea of more involvement, with some moderation to Republicans. This is also Al Gore on the environment. Let's do this one.
This is one of America's most precious resources, part of our heritage, where generations of families have made their living and built their memories. We need to protect our oceans and beaches, and if elected president, I'll do that. I'll not only continue the moratorium on new ocean drilling off California's coast and Florida's, but I'll move to stop drilling in those areas already leased by previous administrations. To be good stewards of our earth, we must create a future worthy of our children.
Okay, so one of the things that Gore focused on was something he called stewards of our earth. Now, Gore was not minor in this detail. Actually, Gore wrote a book called The Inconvenient Truth in 2006, which is also a documentary, and you can watch. I could play the trailer for you.
Good grammar and spelling are important, but if you want to write essays that inspire,
Sorry, I was just trying to make it big. This might get cut out for copyright.
If you look at the 10 hottest years
That's cool.
ever measured, they've all occurred in the last 14 years. And the hottest of all was 2005. Scientific consensus is that we are causing global warming. I am Al Gore. I used to be the next president of the United States of America. This is Patagonia 75 years ago and the same glacier today. This is Mount Kilimanjaro 30 years ago and last year. Within the decade, there will be no more snows of Kilimanjaro. This is really not a political issue so much as a moral issue. Temperature increases are taking place all over the world, and that's causing stronger storms.
This is the biggest crisis in the history of this country.
This is referencing Katrina, right? Okay. So Gore was determined to talk about the environment. Obviously, this is the election of 2000 that we're talking about, and Gore's work comes out in 2006, because basically after he lost the election, he's like, you know what, fuck it. I'm going to say what I want about this. And An Inconvenient Truth really criticized presidents in the past for not having done enough. Now, keep in mind that, like, global warming, again, in the 1970s had been something that most Americans recognized as a problem. But Reagan was the one that was like, well, we don't really need to focus on these things because we should not curb businesses in these ways, so it's not really real. That was the problem of the Republican legacy, and that's what Gore was speaking to. That criticism became more and more true over the course of the 21st century. Okay. This is the last ad I want to show you by Gore.
Through my life, I've always tried to keep the faith. When I was a young man, I volunteered for the Army and went to Vietnam. Tipper and I have been married for 30 years.
I did it again. Sorry.
Through my life, I've always tried to keep the faith. When I was a young man, I volunteered for the Army and went to Vietnam. Tipper and I have been married for 30 years. I've kept faith with my country, and I've made the environment my cause. I believe with all my heart in the future of America, and I believe the next president has to have a passion in his heart to fight for the people who most need a champion. We have to make the right choices to make sure our prosperity continues and works for all Americans.
Okay, so that's a really interesting one because basically in it, Gore says, I have faith. And this is a really, this is one of the criticisms of the Republican Party, which remains very Christian in this decade, right? George Bush is saying, look, we're going to bring back morality to the presidency. We're going to bring back Christianity to the presidency. We're going to bring it back to the Reagan years where we had a really close relationship with fundamentalist Christianity. So Gore is sort of forced to speak to that when he's saying, well, this is what faith means to me, which is why I think that ad is particularly important, is because he's speaking to that broader conversation about morality and faith in the office, which people were very concerned about. And the last one on that ad, which is that I'm going to play Bush.
I believe we need to encourage personal responsibility so people are accountable for their actions. And I believe in government that is responsible to the people. There's a big difference in philosophy between my opponent and me. You trust government? I trust you. I trust you to invest some of your own Social Security money for higher returns. I trust local people to run their own schools. I trust you with some of the budget surplus. We should help people live their lives, but not run them. I'm asking for your vote.
Okay, so that was an immensely popular ad because what Bush is doing is relying on that Republican legacy. Okay, this is rhetorically genius, so bear with me here. Bush is saying two things in that ad. He's saying, one, well, there's no morality in government anymore. That's because of the criticism of Lincoln. God, why do I do that? The criticism of Clinton. God. And then two, he's saying, well, what morality means is trusting people, not trusting the government, which is clearly corrupt and bad. Trusting people, but trusting people is his way of talking about this hands-off government, right? I trust you to figure out what to do with your money. I trust you to figure out what to do with your schools. So you can see the difference between that and Gore saying, well, government has this responsibility to do this. So you can see that by this point in time, the Republican and the Democratic ideologies had become very separate, and this election would only further separate them because it was incredibly close. In fact, this election was so close that, why am I not even playing this for you? The election was so close that it went to the Supreme Court to be decided, which is like ridiculous because Al Gore got the popular vote, but George Bush won. How the hell can that happen? Because of this thing called the Electoral College. We have not spoken too much about the Electoral College. Is that true? I think that's true. We haven't talked too much about the Electoral College in this class. We're going to continue to have that conversation when it comes to the election of Trump, which also ended up being an important moment in the way that people thought about the Electoral College. So technically, when you vote for president, you are not actually casting your vote for president because the popular vote does not determine the office of the presidency. When all these smart people sat around a long time ago deciding what democracy meant, they were like, yeah, democracy's cool and all, but I don't actually want to give the vote to like poor people. That would be disastrous because they're just going to vote in someone who's an idiot and it's going to be mob rule and it's going to be awful. So instead, they decided, well, what if we had the poor people tell us what they wanted and then instead someone who was smart decided if that was a good idea. So basically, the Electoral College is this mediation between the real popular vote and the office of the presidency. You think that I'm kidding? But like, actually, Thomas Jefferson was like, God damn poor people. Like, it was a real thing, okay? Anyway, the Electoral College is that each state gets a certain number of electors. Those electors are based indirectly based on population because they're based on the amount of representation that that state already has in the federal government. Those electors get to vote for president. Those are the electoral votes, and those are the votes that matter when determining who will be president. However, those electoral voters are somewhat beholden to their states. So, and this is where you get into a bit of a difference. So if a state has so many, so Texas has 30-some electors, Texas will vote for president, right? And then if Texas as a state says, well, we want George Bush for president, then the electoral voters are supposed to cast their vote for Bush. And their vote is public, so we know who they voted for. In some states, this is a law. You have to vote for the person that your state voted for. But in other states, it's not. And it's actually unconstitutional to make it a law that you have to vote in this particular way. So there are, at certain points in history, well, there's two problems with the Electoral College. One is that there's no real way to ensure that the electors actually vote for who they're supposed to vote for. Usually that doesn't happen. That's called a faithless elector, and it's real bad faith, and you can actually be like held accountable to it, and most people don't do that. The most faithless electors that there have ever been were in a presidential election where the candidate died. But other than that, there were a couple presidential elections where there were a significant number. The election of Trump was actually one of them. So we're going to talk about that when we talk about Trump. That wasn't the issue in 2000. What the issue was in 2000 was that the people that voted for Gore were disproportionately in certain states, but the states that voted for Bush had more electoral power. So what you ended up in is that while Gore technically won the popular vote by a very, very small amount, he did not win the Electoral College. Bush won the Electoral College. And the reason that he won the Electoral College was because of the distribution of the electoral vote, which increasingly came under criticism in this period. And also came under criticism in this period, the ability to count the votes at all, especially Florida, which ended up being the site of much of the discrepancy. So this cartoon here that I wanted to show you is a person in Florida, this volunteer in Florida counting the votes, going Gore, Bush, Bush, Gore. And the guy is like, are you still counting the ballots in Florida? And he's like, no, I'm counting the court injunctions. In other words, it was so contested that there were a lot of people sued, that there were a lot of legal discrepancies. It had to actually go to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court found, obviously in favor of Bush because he became president. But there were consequences to this. There were consequences to the fact that the election was so controversial. Voters are increasingly disconnected. I mean, I talk about the growing separation of the political parties, but like 50% voter turnout, which is atrocious. Like really one of the lower voter turnouts in all of American history. Because people are like, well, I can't even vote for the president anyway. All the money is raised by businesses. The candidates are not people I would have chosen. They're just talking at one another and slandering one another, and it's all about sex and Clinton, and I don't understand why. And so there were not actually a lot of people that voted, and people were sort of validated in that. They were like, well, why did I vote anyway? Because the Electoral College is the one that decides the president. So there were some consequences to this election. It made national politics more controversial. It made people distrust the national vote. That apathy among Americans, though, disappeared pretty quickly. Because in 2001, in September, so this is just a few months after George Bush takes the presidency, a massive attack was launched on American soil. This attack would be the largest in terms of the casualties to ever hit American soil, and it was the first attack since the attack on Pearl Harbor. And the big difference being Pearl Harbor was a naval base. This was a civilian area. So I will allow you to watch. Rather than talk through everything that happened, I'm going to give you a brief recap. Then we're going to play some news articles. Basically, people that were part of a terrorist organization in the Middle East called Al-Qaeda launched suicide missions to 4 separate places in the Northeast. Those suicide missions involved hijacking planes, and those planes would be flown into buildings. Some of those missions were successful, like the one on the World Trade Centers. Some of them did not end up being successful, like the one that wanted to hit the Capitol building. So I will play for you the newsreels of the time, because they show some pretty interesting footage.
This just in, you are looking at obviously a very disturbing live shot there. That is the World Trade Center, and we have unconfirmed reports this morning that a plane has crashed into one of the towers of the World Trade Center.
I just witnessed a plane that appeared to be cruising slightly lower than normal altitude over New York City, and it appears to have crashed into, I don't know which tower it is, but it hit directly in the middle of one of the World Trade Center towers. The plane just was coming in low, and the wingtips tilted back and forth, and then it flattened out. It looks like it's hit at a slight angle into the World Trade Center. I can see flames now coming out the side of the building, and smoke continues to billow.
I say the whole takes about, looks like 6, 7 floors were taken out. And there's more explosions right now. Hold on, people are running.
Wait, so hold on just a moment. We got an explosion inside.
The building's exploding right now. You got people running up the street.
Okay.
Hold on, I'll tell you what's going on.
Okay, just put Winston on pause there for just a moment.
The whole building just exploded some more. The whole top part.
Okay.
The building's still intact. People are running up the street.
You were looking at this picture. It is the Twin Towers of the World Trade Center, both of them being damaged by impacts from planes. We saw one happen at about maybe 9 minutes before the top of the hour, and just moments ago, so maybe 18 minutes after the first impact, the second tower was impacted by another, what appeared to be another passenger plane.
That's absolutely inexplicable. There shouldn't be any aircraft in that area, much less something heading what looked like deliberately for the World Trade Center tower.
You can watch the rest of this newsreel on your own if you'd like, but I want to emphasize the amount of panic that happened, because Americans aren't used to this. We are not used to attacks on our own soil. It simply does not happen in America in the way that it happens in other countries. We feel very, very safe. So how on earth could this happen? By who? How? Why the World Trade Centers? Why did they target governmental buildings? Why did they target centers of commerce? That has to do with the nature of Al-Qaeda. So what the hell is Al-Qaeda? Okay, that's the conversation that we need to have now. Al-Qaeda is a terrorist organization from the Middle East that was born out of a hatred for America, but also broadly for capitalism and for what it called the West and for Christianity. So in order to understand what this group is, we have to go back a little bit. The first thing that I want to do is encourage you to read the text below, because the text below is going to give you a better sense of timeline than maybe orally you can learn it. I'm gonna try my best to do it orally as well, but try to get the facts and the places straight, because it can be confusing. I also encourage you to look up a map of the Middle East as I am talking so that you can understand that alongside this conversation. Give you a second to pull that up. Okay. The first thing that happens in this timeline is that the Soviet Union had been involved in Afghanistan for a considerable period of time, but they left Afghanistan in 1989. If you remember, 1989 was when global communism was falling. The Soviet Union didn't have enough power to maintain its international reach anyway, and so the puppet government that the Soviet Union had set up as a communist government in that region collapsed. That led to civil war. It led to disastrous consequences for the Afghan people as the country was just plunged into chaos. One of the factions that arose during that time was the Taliban. And the Taliban said, you know, the whole reason that we're having this is because of Soviet intervention. And the solution is not other kinds of intervention. The solution is to focus on our own beliefs as a country, and our own beliefs as a country are Islam. So we need to focus on instituting that particular kind of law, which is called Sharia law. We need to focus on creating a government that is only about these people, not about the West, not about other kinds of intervention. The Taliban is not recognized as the leader of Afghanistan, but they are one of the contenders. So they come to power by 1996. But they are a faction as early as 1990, and so they continue to be influential. So keep that in the back of your head for a second. Now, let's go to 1990. We had a conversation about the United States' relationship with Iraq, right? Iraq is led by Saddam Hussein, and the United States was friendly with Saddam Hussein until Saddam Hussein decided to attack Kuwait, and then we were not. So with international support, we kicked Saddam Hussein out of Kuwait. We talked about this in a previous lecture, right? We talked about this under the first Bush. That was George Bush's father. What happens, though, is that the United States doesn't leave. In that war, the United States had troops stationed in Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia has many holy sites, including Mecca and Medina, and those are very traditional sites of worship. And the United States had troops stationed there. And Saudi Arabia was cool with this, not because they hate their religion and wanted troops stationed there, but because Iraq had a massive army, and they were like, no, you can stay here as protection against future invasion from Iraq, which was very aggressive. And so they sort of stay around, and Saudi Arabia is criticized by its population for allowing United States troops to be so close to those holy sites. Most people are not terribly angry about this, but one is, a traditionalist named Osama bin Laden. He starts to speak out against United States presence in Saudi Arabia. He gets very angry about it. Eventually, the king of Saudi Arabia is like, look, these are our allies. We need their support. You can't do this. So Osama bin Laden is kicked out of Saudi Arabia. However, he, after becoming an international fugitive, finds... So he's hiding in the Sudan, but in 1992, King Fahd wants his extradition because he's a very violent person, and he's starting to run an extremist group, King Fahd being King Fahd of Saudi Arabia. And so by 1996, he finds his way to Afghanistan, and he finds his way to Afghanistan at the same moment that the Taliban is really coming to power. Osama bin Laden believes that the United States should not be in the Holy Lands in the Middle East. The Taliban believes that because of United States and Soviet intervention, traditional Muslim beliefs have been degraded in the area. Osama bin Laden gets along pretty well with the Taliban, so he ends up really making a connection with the Taliban in that area. In 2000, now the United States had known that Al-Qaeda had been planning an attack for some time because they had beliefs that did not jive with the United States, and in fact blamed the United States for many of the problems of the Middle East. Both the Taliban and Al-Qaeda were angry at the United States for encroachment onto holy lands, but particularly Al-Qaeda. Saddam Hussein, Osama bin Laden, in particular, believed in a conspiracy between Christians and Jewish people to eradicate Muslims from the earth. He claimed that the United States was at the head of that conspiracy, trying to wipe out Islam from the planet. He said that you needed to have countries that relied on Sharia law, which was Islamic law, right? Which many people criticize for being far too harsh and particularly violating civil rights. And he said that global immorality, particularly capitalism and Christianity, which he related to one another, were a threat on the region and therefore needed to be taken care of. And he tried to do this through terroristic acts that tried to get the United States to leave the region. Now, the United States had known he was violent for a long time. They didn't think he was that much of a threat. Bush said that Afghanistan should be held accountable for, I'm going to move slowly here, Afghanistan should be held accountable for the 2001 attack because they were harboring Osama bin Laden. They were protecting Al-Qaeda. And therefore, he was going to invade Afghanistan and wage a war on terror. I want to play with you what he said to the nation on the night of 9/11.
Today, our fellow citizens, our way of life, our very freedom came under attack in a series of deliberate and deadly terrorist acts. The victims were in airplanes or in their offices, secretaries, businessmen and women, military and federal workers, moms and dads, friends and neighbors. Thousands of lives were suddenly ended by evil, despicable acts of terror. The pictures of airplanes flying into buildings, fires burning, huge structures collapsing, have filled us with disbelief, terrible sadness, and a quiet, unyielding anger. These acts of mass murder were intended to frighten our nation into chaos and retreat. But they have failed. Our country is strong. A great people has been moved to defend a great nation. Terrorist attacks can shake the foundations of our biggest buildings, but they cannot touch the foundation of America. These acts shatter steel, but they cannot dent the steel of American resolve. America was targeted for attack because we're the brightest beacon for freedom and opportunity in the world, and no one will keep that light from shining.
This is regarded as one of the more powerful speeches that a president has ever given. And the reason is that think about the amount of emotional work that Bush had to do on that night when America was reeling in chaos. And that was the goal of the terrorist attack. He's absolutely right on that. The goal was to instill chaos. And he basically, in this speech so far, has said, they can do that to us, and that's a problem. They can attack us, and that's a problem. But they cannot instill that chaos. Do not allow them to instill that chaos.
Today, our nation saw evil, the very worst of human nature. And we responded with the best of America, with the daring of our rescue workers, with the caring for strangers and neighbors who came to give blood and help in any way they could. Immediately following the first attack, I implemented our government's emergency response plans. Our military is powerful, and it's prepared. Our emergency teams are working in New York City and Washington, D.C. to help with local rescue efforts. Our first priority is to get help to those who have been injured and to take every precaution to protect our citizens at home and around the world from further attacks.
This was a massive effort, and it was both federal and local. Usually the story after things like this is to talk about ineptitude at the federal and the local level, but that just didn't happen. Actually, there was an immense response, particularly locally, but also federally, to helping people that were the victims of this attack, in New York City in particular.
The functions of our government continue without interruption. Federal agencies in Washington, which had to be evacuated today, are reopening for essential personnel tonight and will be open for business tomorrow. Our financial institutions remain strong, and the American economy will be open for business as well. The search is
Those are all things, of course, that the attack meant to disrupt.
underway for those who are behind these evil acts. I've directed the full resources of our intelligence and law enforcement communities to find those responsible and to bring them to justice. We will make no distinction between the terrorists who committed these acts and those who harbor them.
That is critical right now. It is not just about the person that did this. It's about the country that supports the person that did this. That's already, right, the belief that this was Afghanistan on the very night of.
I appreciate so very much the members of Congress who have joined me in strongly condemning these attacks. And on behalf of the American people, I thank the many world leaders who have called to offer their condolences and assistance. America and our friends and allies join with all those who want peace and security in the world. And we stand together to win the war against terrorism.
That was the first time it was said, and it became important. This is a war against terrorism. Not a war against any person in particular, although it would become that, but a war against this idea that you can terrify the rest of the world into submission. Now, terrorism was not new. Terrorism was not a new phenomenon in this part of time, but it became associated with one particular region and one particular belief during this time.
Tonight, I ask for your prayers for all those who grieve, for the children whose worlds have been shattered, for all whose sense of safety and security has been threatened. And I pray they will be comforted by a power greater than any of us, spoken through the ages in Psalm 23. Even though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I fear no evil.
It is pretty remarkable that the president is quoting from the Bible. I mean, I don't... What's interesting about this is that this was exactly what the attack was against, right? It's the accusation that the United States is a Christian nation, and that's what's causing discrepancy in the Middle East. And Bush responds by quoting from the Bible. I think that speaks for itself.
For you are with me. This is a day when all Americans from every walk of life unite in our resolve for justice and peace. America has stood down enemies before, And we will do so this time. None of us will ever forget this day, yet we go forward to defend freedom and all that is good and just in our world. Thank you. Good night, and God bless America.
So that was an incredibly important speech. I know that I don't generally watch the entirety of a speech with you, but in 4 minutes, Bush accomplished so much. In that speech, he manages to talk to America about the differences. He draws new dividing lines between us and them. And those dividing lines are very much so based in this world of religion and of economics, and those are terrorists and evil people, and we are not. And that is because of this particular moment. It's true about what they did, right? Okay, I'm going to see if I can pause Camtasia for a second. Resuming. Pros of asynchronous teaching is I can pause to warm up my coffee because I talk too much, and I did realize as I looked at it that we are at 40 minutes and these are getting increasingly longer. So good job being patient with me. Let's talk about war. So just after this attack, the United States waged a war in Afghanistan. And the reason that they did so is because Bush said, and he was right, that the Taliban was harboring Osama bin Laden. And this was widely supported. The United Nations was like, yeah, they're harboring a terrorist. That makes sense. And so it was a phased attack. It was an attack that was very successful and very quick. The international community supported it because it was a moral war. The United States was very much in support of it because they were harboring a man who attacked the United States through an act of terror. That doesn't mean that it's the fault of the Afghan population, though. Keep in mind that Afghanistan is itself undergoing civil war and is itself in the grip of a totalitarian regime, which is the Taliban. The United States and the UN's involvement between 2001 and 2002 pretty quickly overturns the power of the Taliban. They oust that particular faction from government. The problem is that the Taliban is an insurgency after that point that is disastrously powerful because they do enjoy a lot of local support. And so the Taliban continues to harass the new government that the United States put in place. That new government does not have a lot of control. And so it takes the United States until 2011 to transition control to Afghan troops to try to keep the Taliban in control. Although those troops remain there, we are still present in Afghanistan. So it's this understanding that in order to keep the Taliban out of control from reasserting control, which is a very dangerous enemy that should not have it, we need to maintain a pretty constant presence in the region. The problem is that this very supported war in Afghanistan was not the only war that Bush waged. As that war continued, Bush said, the problem is not just Afghanistan, the problem is all over the Middle East. And he called Afghanistan, Iraq, and Iran an axis of evil. Now remember, the United States was not friendly with Iraq, right? After the Gulf War, after the United States turned against Saddam Hussein, we do not like Iraq. We had never liked Iran. We were not in good terms with them for a very, very long time, since the 1970s at least. And so the United States starts to, well, let me put that a different way. George Bush starts to wrap that all together and say that is an axis of evil that threatens the entire world. I want to play the speech for you that he gives for that.
These days, it's anything but business as usual. That's why working together is more important than ever. AT&T is committed to keeping you connected so you can keep your patients cared for, your customers served, your students inspired, and your employees closer than ever.
Our second goal is to prevent regimes that sponsor terror from threatening America or our friends and allies with weapons of mass destruction. Some of these regimes have been pretty quiet since September the 11th. But we know their true nature. North Korea is a regime arming with missiles and weapons of mass destruction while starving its citizens. Iran aggressively pursues these weapons and exports terror, while an unelected few repress the Iranian people's hope for freedom. Iraq continues to flaunt its hostility toward America and to support terror. The Iraqi regime has plotted to develop anthrax and nerve gas and nuclear weapons for over a decade. This is a regime that has already used poison gas to murder thousands of its own citizens, leaving the bodies of mothers huddled over their dead children. This is a regime that agreed to international inspections, then kicked out the inspectors. This is a regime that has something to hide from the civilized world.
Iraq.
States like these and their terrorist allies constitute an axis of evil, arming to threaten the peace of the world. By seeking weapons of mass destruction, these regimes pose a grave and growing danger. They could provide these arms to terrorists, giving them the means to match their hatred. They could attack our allies or attempt to blackmail the United States. In any of these cases, the price of indifference would be catastrophic.
Okay.
These days, it's anything but business.
This is a really interesting speech. Because it's an interesting speech because it confuses people. Because Bush says those are all evil people in these countries. And he doesn't want them to have weapons of mass destruction. And not wanting our enemies to have weapons of mass destruction makes a certain amount of sense, right? But it's this idea that those regions are out to get us, that they are growing in power, and that they support terrorism. And we need to do something fast and act against this axis of evil. It's an interesting word that he uses, especially because this is what the Axis powers had been called in World War II, which is an understandably moral war, right? A lot of people have accused Bush of instigating a war because the war in Afghanistan was so popular and he wanted to continue that popularity. Regardless of whatever you think in that, in 2002, Bush proposed a regime change in Iraq. He said we need to oust Saddam Hussein because Saddam Hussein has weapons of mass destruction. Those weapons of mass destruction never materialized. Actually, it was found later that he absolutely did not have any weapons of mass destruction. But Bush didn't actually really need a lot of proof because people were really panicked about the Middle East. And the Middle East became this fear that was itself equated. And Iraq and Afghanistan... No, I'm not going to find that South Park clip. There's this belief that the Middle East is just all the same place.
If you watch South Park, there's one where Saddam Hussein takes over Canada, and he's like, Iran, Iraq, what's the difference, pal? Haha, guy. Anyway, the joke is that Americans don't know the difference. And there's a massive fear of the Middle East. And so while people had been on board with the invasion of Afghanistan, the UN was like, no, you can't do that. You can't invade Iraq. You have no proof on which to invade Iraq. And so this was not an internationally supported war. The Afghan war was. The Iraqi war was not. And so, nevertheless, the war took place, and it was very, very successful very quickly, very early on. By 2003, Saddam Hussein was overthrown. He was eventually found and killed in, I think, 2006. Although I might be wrong on that. He was eventually killed. A new government comes in, and the United States attempts to withdraw. However, the ISIS, or the Islamic State, which is against U.S. involvement, rises. And so there's, again, continual United States requirement in order to maintain stability in the region. This war on terror that he waged, which was a diplomatic war against North Korea and a very violent war against Iraq, was widely criticized by a lot of people. People criticized it for a couple of reasons. First, he never got UN approval. And he didn't get UN approval because the people that went in to find weapons of mass destruction never found weapons of mass destruction, and so the UN would not support him. He was also criticized because this war on terror is vague. In the war in Iraq, there were terrorists. There were actual people that were being targeted. But when he said all of these places support terror, that was very vague. What are they supporting? Why, right? Like, what are they angry about? They're angry about U.S. capitalistic involvement. They're angry about the United States controlling oil in the region. They're angry about the way that Christianity discriminates against Islam. And they had some legitimate grievances, but some people took those into acts of terror. And Bush conflated the people that take them into acts of terror and the grievances. It became very vague. He capitalized on vagueness. And then there was also the criticism that whenever the United States gets involved like this, there's instability in the region that causes harm to citizens. And that instability in the region requires constant U.S. presence. So why would you involve us in something that's going to require a constant re-upping of American presence? So I'm not going to spend too much time on this, but Bush was widely internationally condemned for this war. In fact, in a couple of areas, he was tried and found guilty of war crimes. So I've linked you into this article about it. And yes, Al Jazeera tends to be a little bit more leftist of a source, but it does give you the history of how a tribunal, the Kuala Lumpur War Crimes Tribunal, found Bush and Tony Blair guilty of crimes against peace, humanity, and guilty of genocide because of the Iraq War. So if you are interested, this gives you a good sense of that history. But I want to clarify how widely condemned this was, globally speaking. It was also condemned at home, particularly because as part of the war in Iraq, which was very unpopular, Bush passed the Patriot Act, or re-upped the Patriot Act and clarified it. This was an act that was originally passed in the wake of the September 11th attacks, but was strengthened during the war in Iraq, and it was meant to prevent terrorism, internal terrorism, but it was actually used in practice after the war in Iraq to criticize people that criticized Bush, or to hold people accountable that criticized Bush. And it gave the federal government widespread authority to do things like monitor cell phones and check internet histories and search houses without people knowing. And a lot of that stuff was eventually made illegal because people said that it was a violation of civil rights. It also was called ineffective. Now that would be changed. The Patriot Act would be amended under the Obama administration, but it remains a pretty critical way that the federal government changed how much power they can have over people's lives. And the war was criticized in particular because of torture at Abu Ghraib, which I cannot pronounce. Abu Ghraib. It was found out that at a military base in Iraq, Americans were torturing people, and these were people that were involved in the effort, right? These were people that were involved in anti-U.S. presence. But the tortures that they were undergoing were not sanctioned by the military, were against the Geneva Convention, were not supposed to happen. And there was both physical violence and psychological violence and sexual violence against prisoners. And Bush tried to frame, the U.S. Army was found guilty of this, right? But the United States Army and President Bush tried to put this on a few people, tried to say it was just a couple people that knew about this, it was just a couple bad eggs in the American Army, we're going to hold them accountable, relieve them of their positions, and that's that. But later investigations found out that higher ranks of the military and Bush himself knew about this torture. Those criticisms, though, came after the 2004 election. So all of this is ongoing throughout Bush's presidency. In 2004, he narrowly won the election, and so he continues to be president through 2008. And he's widely criticized. He's widely criticized for a few reasons. I'm actually going to talk first about this one, and then I'll talk about these. But Bush is criticized because this increased aggression against people in the Middle East leads to increased aggression against Muslims in America. And there's a greater fear of Islam in general. So Islam as a religion is not all that different than Christianity in the fact that it's actually much closer to Christianity than Judaism is. But it believes in one God, it believes in a lot of the same ideas. But the thing about Muslims is that there is a law called Sharia law, which is the prescribed law for Islam. Most of the time, it is not actually implemented in the government. Most Muslims do not believe that it should be. However, there are some that do. But Americans assumed that all Muslims believe in Sharia law, and all Muslims believed that there should be draconian policies in place. And basically, this led to the homogenization of Muslims. And it led to discrimination against them in America because people did not understand and were, in many cases, willfully ignorant. So there were a lot of acts of terror against Muslims in the United States. There were burning of mosques. There was graffiti on the walls. There was anti-Muslim hiring policies and all sorts of issues that were discriminatory against Muslims. This is often considered a race issue as well because many Muslims are not American. And so there are new lines drawn in racial battles. There are others that are further solidified. Bush was one of the first presidents to start to say, we really need to curb immigration from Mexico. He was pretty famous for saying, criticizing Spanish speakers in the United States, and just really saying they need to learn how to speak English. They need to learn, he said that the national anthem should never be sung in Spanish, things like that. And he did nothing to address growing economic inconsistencies between Americans and Mexicans. And also, he was very antagonistic to the NAACP. So he said, basically, we need to worry about international affairs. I can't focus on rights at home. That we just don't have enough energy for that. And in so doing, he refused to meet with the NAACP, refused to acknowledge the needs of African Americans in that moment. And all of these things would become exacerbated by Hurricane Katrina. So Hurricane Katrina happened in 2005. So this is just after the election of Bush, the second election of Bush. And Hurricane Katrina was a Category 3 hurricane, I'm pretty sure, that hit New Orleans. And this hurricane hit New Orleans very directly. The bulk of the winds happened actually in the city. The flooding also happened in the city. And it was just simply devastating. It was a terrible, terrible hurricane. And it was a terrible hurricane because of a few reasons. One, the nature of a Category 3 hurricane is terrible. You've all seen a Category 4 hurricane when Harvey came through here, and Harvey, of course, caused numerous deaths. Despite the fact that Harvey was a bigger storm, most of the winds of Harvey hit a pretty unpopulated area. They hit just north of Corpus Christi. And while those were devastating, those deaths there were devastating, it just wasn't an area, it wasn't a city, right? New Orleans was a city. It was a city that was below sea level to begin with. Harvey caused a lot more devastation when it caused flooding. Essentially, Katrina caused winds and flooding in the same place, right? So because of the nature of a Category 3, because of the fact that New Orleans was below sea level, because of the fact that the infrastructure of New Orleans was very old and did not have the ability to withstand hurricanes, because of the fact that people weren't prepared for Katrina. Now, don't blame people too much for that. You can't prepare for a hurricane if you can't afford to prepare for a hurricane. And this was a particularly poor area that Katrina hit. And FEMA was very slow to respond. Local officials were a little bit faster to respond, but he didn't support those local officials. And the areas that were harder hit by Katrina were more often poor. And because of all of the historical reasons that we have talked about in this class, those poorer regions are generally not white regions. Those poorer regions are usually African American regions. And many people said that the administration simply didn't respond because it didn't care about the people that had been hit, because it happened all the way in the South, and because it happened to black people, and we don't care about black people. That was the accusation. So I had you read a piece by Jamel Bowie about how the Black Lives Matter movement came out of Katrina, because it was this belief that the administration didn't care about people who died or suffered under Katrina because Black lives don't matter. So it was how Black Lives Matter began. I have a couple of quotes from you from this that are very important. A few here that I just want to highlight. We have an amazing tolerance for Black pain. It's this accusation that people didn't care about the victims of Katrina because they were Black. We have this tolerance to Black pain. Some of the ways that you can see this, well, never mind. Read the article. It's excellent. And I think that Bowie speaks for herself in this, and I plan on utilizing this article on the test. So make sure you read carefully. Bush's presidency and our story about his presidency ends with the Great Recession. The Great Recession did not come out of nowhere. There were some warning signs in the economy, but the thing about warning signs is that they're much more easy to spot in hindsight. The recession happened because of a bubble in the housing market, and those indications were building, but nobody believed that it would be such a terrible recession, and economists are still arguing about how this happened. So don't growl at me. I will take you out when I take you out. Clearly, I need to wrap up this lecture. Economists still argue about how this happened. So, in one sense, I don't feel qualified as a historian to make this analysis. But it is clear that there were some signs that a depression was coming. However, people did not know how bad it would be. The issue came over a housing bubble, and the United States economy tanked in late 2007, early 2008. It was just starting, which is when Obama ran for president. So this recession takes effect around then. It became very, very bad, but it really only became bad after Obama took office. So that would be where we transition into next time, talking about Obama and talking about the rise of Trump. Okay, that's what I've got for you. I want you to think about these few things as you write your discussion post for today, and let me know if you have questions. Oh, sorry. You have one more video lecture left, and then after that, we are meeting as a class. So make sure you plan ahead for that. All right. Y'all have a good day. Stay safe and stay sane. That is the issue in Corona, isn't it? Only going slightly mad.